we hear some of the more psychologically profound words, psychologically penetrating words, if you will, in the gospel today from Luke. It says this: Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. How often those two go together. Psychologists and Catholic saints and mystics, etc., all seem to be agreeing on the same point, that the most deadly of all sins is the sin of pride. God hates pride, and so do we. We think about it, we bristle at those times where we observe pride on display. If you think of athletic contests, despite so many of them being built around team and the people and coaches that help someone accomplish a feat, sometimes we see a person who has just scored a basket or a touchdown or a goal celebrating themselves, despite all the other people it took to make that happen. We bristle at that. We bristle at the people that, when engaging us in conversation, may not say this directly, but essentially say, "Let me talk to you about my children for the next 20 minutes." We also bristle at those times in conversation where someone is essentially, although not directly, saying, "You might not have heard about my accomplishments, but let me tell you, I need to tell you that I'm kind of a big deal." On the other side of that coin, we do also love humility. We love displays of humility. We love seeing other people who are humble. We love being around other people who are humble. We love seeing acts of humility. People who could draw attention to themselves in some way, but instead lift up or affirm other people and celebrate them. The people that don't want to talk about themselves until they have first heard about us. We are made in God's image and likeness, so we shouldn't be surprised that God says the root of all sin, the thing that in a sense displeases God the most, is pride, because it displeases us when we see it, and we're made in the image and likeness of God. And in the same way, God loves humility just as we do as well. So why do we who are made in the image and likeness of God, and why does God find pride to be so problematic? Why does God say that it is the root of all evil, of all sins? Did God spin a wheel of sins and just decide, okay, which one will I hate the most? And then it landed on pride? I think not. The reason that God obviously despises the sin of pride the most is because he knows that it harms us the most. And the reason that humility is held up for us is for no other reason than to be a humble person is healthy and good for us. I think we do well to reflect just a little bit on the particular sin of pride and why it is at the root of all other sins and why it is to be something rooted out. Because I think a lot of times when we first hear about pride, we exempt ourselves and we say that that doesn't describe me, which is the first sign of a problem. What are the roots of pride? Where does it come from? What might we learn as we look at that particular sin? Again, as I mentioned, even in the realm of psychology, this sin is being talked about, although it's not called a sin. We can't call things sin in science. But we hear a lot more about the particular psychological affliction of narcissism, which, again, I think is, as we see psychology and so on and so forth wrestling with this idea of narcissism, we hear from the spiritual side about the sin of pride. We see, I think, a really great intersection of science and faith coming together to talk about the same thing from their various points of view, various aspects of both faith and reason. So one of the ways that we see that is actually there was an author, psychologist who was writing in the 80s, 90s, most especially, Dr. M. Scott Peck, whose books were sold millions and millions of copies, The Road Less Traveled, Glimpses of Evil. And he was in those books sharing as a Christian psychologist, some of the things that he's observed, kind of trying to bring together the two, the spiritual component of his belief in Jesus and what he's observed through his years of practice as a psychologist. And so as he set out to explain his understanding or his experiences of evil, he pulled from a very interesting source and maybe a strange source at first. He uses J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings novels, and particularly a character that is in them known as a creature, the creature Gollum. And we should take pride in that because J.R.R. Tolkien, being a Catholic, very much was trying in that particular creature to describe the problems of sin, the problems particularly of pride. And other Catholic commentators and spiritual authors have also used this particular creature from Tolkien to talk about this problem of pride. So what can we learn from that? What is it that Tolkien about Catholic theology of pride was he trying to pour into this character? Well, you may notice, even if you're not familiar, it's not like you have to go watch the movie before this makes any sense, I hope. But the creature, it said, Tolkien describes this particular creature who is at this point in his life deformed and worn down and sort of, a scary type of person, but was originally a healthy human type of person. But this sin of pride has deformed this creature into something that is scary and self-consumed. Tolkien says something very insightful about this creature that I think, again, applies to our understanding of pride. He says that this creature both hated and loved himself. Both hated and loved himself. And in that very simple phrase, I think we get to the root of the sin of pride and what's going on there. First of all, in pride, we have this coming together of an intense self-hatred and also an overinflated love of self, which seems to be contradictory. And in fact, in some sense, they are contradictory, which is precisely the problem. So why, first of all, hate? Why hatred of oneself? We all, when we look inward, whether or not we believe in Jesus, whether or not we profess any faith at all, when we look inside ourselves as human beings, there are parts of us that we find to be problematic. We call it, of course, sin, the sins that we've committed. We know, and when looking at them, that we're not pleased by them, not because some God tells us from the sky that they're bad, but because, first and foremost, we just know and recognize that they're not good, which is why the God in the sky says, watch out for them. But we see them in ourselves. We see those moments of sin, those moments where we fall short of the person that we were made to be. Now, in that moment, though, we all see that. The saints all saw that, right? We all see that, but we face two paths at that moment where we see something inside ourselves that displeases us, that causes us shame, the sins that we are aware of. We have two paths. One of them psychologically healthy, spiritually healthy, etc., and one of them leads to insanity. The two paths are named after apostles in my mind. I named the one path the path of St. Peter. Peter commits one of the most objectively heinous sins that one can commit. He literally denies Jesus. And he does it 3 times in Jesus' probably most desperate hour of needing someone to be with him and to support him and to stand up with him. Precisely in that moment, Peter denies Jesus. But what does Peter do? So he recognizes his sinfulness, he is ashamed of what he has done, and he eventually approaches God and approaches Jesus in sorrow and asking for forgiveness. That is the path that leads to sanity, that leads to health, that leads to spiritual integrity. The other path is named after the apostle Judas, who does the exact same sin. He denies Jesus. He hands him over. He doesn't think of him as the God of the universe. He hands him over and betrays him in a very similar way to what St. Peter did. They both betray Jesus. But Judas does not ask for forgiveness. He goes and kills himself, thinking that he is unlovable, unforgivable, or whatever other sorts of self-deception he told himself and the devil suggested to him. But for whatever it was, whatever the motivation, he saw something in himself that he had to kill, that could not continue. And that is the path of Judas. The same sin, the same recognition, we have two different options before us. And if we take the path of Judas, what we end up doing, we may not hang ourselves from a tree, but we also kill ourselves in a different sense. And it is this that psychologists and saints talk about as well. We bury down deep and we suppress and cover over that part of our life, and we, in a sense, kill it. Instead of letting God redeem it, instead of saying, I see in myself this sinfulness, these shortcomings, now I'm going to let Jesus heal these, hand them over to God. We don't do that because we, in our pride, we keep them down and we bury them and we don't let God in because we think that we are the best sinner of all time and have done something that, despite God's unlimited mercy, we have found the sin in ourselves that God cannot forgive. And so we suppress it and we keep it down. Now, what we have to do when we do that is create a false self that resurrects in its place of the self that we have killed, the self that we bury down deep. And so we create another identity, a false identity. And it is pride that motivates us to do that. The problem is that new self, the self that we love, again, remembering Tolkien's phrase, the creature hated and loved himself. We create a new self that we then have to sustain and keep going because it's not real. We have to be fed. We have to feed the beast, so to speak. We have to feed and have constant praise, constant adulation, constantly things that sustain it and keep the lie going of this false self. Now, this might sound like something very familiar to you. It should. Social media. We live in an age where it is even more dangerous because that is precisely what some of the social media provides us an opportunity to do, to create another self. I'm very thankful that I didn't grow up with that as a teenager and through my years in college. I was able to, in some sense, get a handle on who I was and understand myself as a whole person, as opposed to having that constant temptation out there to create some false vision of myself that can constantly be affirmed, that can constantly seek adulation, etc., etc. So it's very tempting and something that we should be paying attention to as young people and as parents. Are we portraying a false self to other people, whether it's in person, in conversation, or online? But we see, again, this dual reality so often. And it's not always, again, it's also important to realize that this happens on a sliding scale. I may not be completely pathologically so with these two selves that I have, one that I hate in myself and another that I hold up and lift up and need constantly sustained. But there may be an aspect to that. I may be somewhat that way. And so to whatever extent that may be describing us, where we may be, like Luke says in the gospel, people who are convinced of our own righteousness and despise everyone else, whatever extent we're on that scale, we need to root that out. We need to stop seeing other people who simply exist in my life to affirm me, to build me up, to keep some false understanding of who I am around. That can often be one of the biggest problems of pride, is if I do create that false self in some way, then I'm only starting to see people as objects who exist in orbit around me, as opposed to people who have their own dignity and are not simply there just to like and affirm and keep my spirits up, so to speak. So what do we do about these problems? What do we do about the situation of pride? What do we do to make sure that we are not people who are convinced of our own righteousness and despise everyone else? What do we do to make sure that we are more like the humble tax collector and less like the arrogant Pharisee? Put forward a couple of things to think about and incorporate it into our lives. One of the things I think that we need to be able to do is to be people who can go off by ourselves in silent prayer on a regular basis. When we are alone with ourselves and alone with God, we can't help but recognize and confront, to whatever extent I have started to allow this false narrative of myself to exist. When I'm alone with God, I can't run from the truth. I can run from the truth very conveniently when I'm in the midst of distractions and other people and the hustle and bustle of the world, but I cannot lie and hide from that if I am alone at prayer. What do we know about Jesus? Every time the morning is mentioned in the Gospels, it says he went off to be alone with the Father. And so we do well to imitate the Lord in that. Other types of prayers, rosaries, scriptural reading, those are all great forms of prayer too, but we have to be people who also are regularly going to be still before God, because that is a mirror that will show us who we really are. I think another way that we can combat this temptation to somehow be prideful, to create a false self, to begin to create this line that fuels pride, is to be people who go to confession regularly. I think Jesus set up the sacrament. People say all the time, why can't I pray on my couch to God? It's much easier. Ask God to forgive me. The reason we have the sacrament of confession, I think, is precisely to combat what we're talking about today. There is a real value, spiritually speaking, psychologically speaking, to hear myself say out loud to another person, this is my shortcoming. These are the areas in my life where I am not living up to what it is that God made me to be. We grow in that. That is a way of handing over that part of ourself that we may be tempted to bury down deep. That's a way of handing it to God and saying, Lord, I trust you and your mercy. Help fix these wounds. Help repair me. Another thing to think about with regards to this sin of pride, a good indicator that I may be starting to think of myself as the center of the universe and perhaps even the creator of the universe. Asking ourselves a simple question. When I think of the teachings of the church, the teachings of Scripture, the teachings that God put forward, do I seek to bend them to my will, or do I bend my will to conform with the teachings of the church, of God, of the Scriptures, etc.? The moment we begin to see the teachings that the church puts forward, that God speaks to us through the church and through the Scriptures, the moment we look at those and start to say, I wonder which of these I shall live by, and we take some and we leave others behind, we are then, in a sense, making ourselves the center of the universe. Whereas there is nothing more healthy for me to say, I don't understand that, or I struggle with that, but I recognize that I am not the center of the universe. I will conform my will and my life to that. That is, in a sense, that is a great way to shatter those opportunities where we may be tempted to think of ourselves as the best human being to ever walk the planet. Another great way to combat this sin of pride and to seek to live more integrally and more wholly as one is to ask for other people to evaluate us regularly with their feedback. If you have friends that are real friends, and if you live in a community that is an authentic community, the moment you ask them for feedback, they will be ready. One of the great parts about the seminary for me was living in a community, and we regularly evaluated one another. Every time we went through those evaluations, there were pages and pages of feedback from our brothers. And so I think having that opportunity to go to other people and to ask them, what do you see when you see me? What are some things that you've noticed in me as a person that I have been vulnerable with, who knows me well and who has interacted with me? Are we asking for other people's honest feedback? Or do we ask for it but not really want it? I think it's important for us to seek that out on a regular basis and to allow others to give us things to work on. Spiritual direction is another great way to encounter that, to open our wounds, to throw out, this is who I am, and to have someone else help us navigate through that. The very act of coming to Mass and worshiping God is a great antidote to the sin of pride, because it is a recognition that there is a God and it is not me. I'm here to worship. This is what we're doing in this particular Mass and in every Mass. We come here and we worship and praise God for God's goodness and for all that God is. That is a very healthy thing and an obvious antidote to starting to think that I am God. Our Lady of Humility, one of the titles of our Blessed Mother that many people ask for intercession is Our Lady of Humility. Praying for humility is a great way to receive it. So many people have often said, be careful when praying for humility, God will give it to you. So we have to want it and we have to trust that it is for our good when we're seeking it out. Jesus addressed, we hear in the Gospels, again, Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. May we not be people who are convinced of our own righteousness, but rather be people who are working out our righteousness in the eyes of God and with the grace of God. May we not be people who despise everyone else, directly or indirectly, but may we love one another as ourselves.